The sun rose slowly over Green Vale Wildlife Reserve, casting a golden hue across the vast expanse of African wilderness. Here, in this protected haven, life thrived in its purest form, untamed, majestic, and fiercely alive. Towering acacia trees dotted the horizon, and herds of antelope grazed peacefully while the sounds of the wild filled the air. It was a place of balance, where predator and prey danced to the rhythm of survival. But even in this sanctuary, danger sometimes slithered in silence. Ranger Elijah Mwangi stood on the wooden deck of the main observation outpost, staring into the distant forest with narrowed eyes. A veteran of the reserve, Elijah had devoted his life to protecting the wildlife of Green Vale. His weathered hands and creased face told stories of close encounters, narrow escapes, and long nights under the stars. But today, something felt wrong. Lindeway, the young researcher stationed at the communication desk, called out from inside, "Ranger Elijah, we just received a report from the acoustic monitor in Sector 9. There's a strange call, deep, drawn out, and nothing like we've heard before." Elijah's expression darkened. "Sector 9?" he repeated. That area of the reserve was remote, seldom visited by rangers, and known to be the home of Kumba, the dominant silverback gorilla of Green Vale. Kumba was no ordinary animal. Strong, intelligent, and fiercely protective of his troop, he had lived undisturbed in the heart of the forest for years. His presence kept the forest in balance, warding off intruders, animal or human. Elijah had seen him once, years ago, during a patrol after a wildfire. The memory of Kumba's gaze, calm yet powerful, still lingered with him. The thought of something unusual happening in Kumba's territory sent a ripple of unease through Elijah. Without hesitation, he strapped on his field gear, checked his tranquilizer rifle, and set off on foot towards Sector 9. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became. Birdsong faded into a heavy silence. The usual signs of life, footprints, broken branches, distant animal calls, were replaced with an eerie stillness. It wasn't just empty. It felt watched. Then he saw it: trampled foliage, massive drag marks in the dirt, and gouges in tree bark. Elijah knelt to examine the marks. They were unlike anything he had ever encountered. Whatever passed through here was big. Bigger than any lion, bigger than Kumba, and recent. A sudden, bone-chilling cry pierced the air. It wasn't a roar or a screech. It was a deep, guttural bellow, full of pain and fury. Elijah bolted toward the sound, his instincts driving him forward through thickets and roots until he emerged at the edge of a wide clearing. There, beneath the shafts of sunlight that broke through the canopy, stood Kumba, battered but unbowed. Blood streaked his thick gray fur, and his chest heaved with exertion. In front of him loomed a creature from nightmare, a giant serpent, at least 10 meters long, its scales dark as oil and eyes cold and calculating. Naga. The name sprang to Elijah's mind from old legends. The tribes around Green Vale whispered of a monstrous snake said to be centuries old. A spirit of vengeance born from the earth itself. Most had dismissed it as myth. Yet here it was, real, alive, and coiled with murderous intent. Kumba roared and beat his chest. A challenge and a warning. Naga responded with a hiss that echoed across the trees. Then lunged. The two collided with terrifying force. Kumba slammed a fist into the serpent's snout. But Naga twisted around him, its thick body tightening like a vice. Elijah raised his rifle, but the creatures were too close. One wrong shot could kill them both. Kumba struggled violently, his breath coming in desperate grunts. His hands found a thick branch and with a last surge of strength, he drove it into Naga's eye. The serpent shrieked, uncoiling just enough for Kumba to break free. He staggered back, bloodied but still defiant. Elijah knew this couldn't go on. He had to intervene. He crept closer, rifle raised, waiting for a clear shot. Naga thrashed, blinded on one side, then reared its head again, targeting the weakened gorilla. Elijah exhaled slowly, steadied his aim, and fired. The first dart struck Naga near the neck. The serpent recoiled, shrieking in rage. Elijah loaded the second dart. Heart-pounding, Naga turned toward him, its massive body slithering through the grass with unnatural speed. Elijah fired again. This time, the dart struck true. Naga's advance slowed. Its body writhed violently, crashing through trees as the tranquilizer took effect. Moments later, it collapsed, its massive form quivering before falling still. The forest was silent again. Elijah approached cautiously, rifle still raised. Kumba stood nearby, watching him. The silverback's breath was ragged, but his eyes were calm. For a moment, man and beast regarded one another in the dappled sunlight, bound by a shared battle, a mutual respect. Elijah gave a small nod. "You did well, old friend," he said quietly. Kumba grunted, then turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the green. Later, back at the outpost, Elijah filed his report. Naga had been sedated and would be relocated far from the reserve. The forest was safe, for now. But he knew nature always found a way to challenge itself. And deep within the heart of Green Vale, the wild still called to those who would listen. The forest thickened as Elijah Mwangi pushed deeper into the remote parts of Green Vale Wildlife Reserve. Each step he took felt heavier, not just from the weight of his gear, but from the weight of something unseen, an atmosphere thick with tension. The sounds of birds had grown faint, replaced by the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch echoing through the trees. He knew this part of the reserve well, but today it felt unfamiliar, as if the forest itself held its breath. Leaves brushed against his arms, and vines curled like fingers across the trail, slowing his pace. The ground was littered with odd signs, unsettling ones. A patch of blood smeared across a broad leaf. A tree, easily a century old, splintered at its base. Tufts of fur clung to the bark, ripped from some unfortunate animal in a struggle. Elijah knelt and examined the scene, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. There had been a violent confrontation here. Not long ago. Something big, he muttered to himself. He rose and continued forward, heart racing with a mix of dread and purpose. This was no poacher's work. No trap. Whatever had passed through here was primal, powerful, and unbound by human rules. And somewhere ahead, possibly in danger, was Kumba. The trail twisted into a narrow gully where the forest grew darker. The air turned heavy and humid, and Elijah's skin prickled with the awareness of being watched. A sound caught his ear, a low grunt, deep and labored, then a hiss, long, angry, and so deep it vibrated through the earth itself. He broke into a run. The trees gave way to a clearing framed by ancient baobab trees. In the center, a struggle unfolded so immense and raw that Elijah froze mid-step. Kumba, the great silverback, was on his knees, his thick arms bound by the crushing coils of Naga, the giant serpent. Naga's body pulsed and twisted with inhuman strength. Its scales shimmered like wet stone, and its eyes glowed faintly with a predator's fury. The gorilla roared in defiance, muscles straining as he fought against the crushing grip of the snake. Every movement was a battle, every breath, a victory. For a moment, Elijah stood paralyzed. He had never seen anything so primal, so terrible and beautiful at once. The guardian of the forest and the serpent of legend, locked in a death struggle beneath the open sky. He slowly raised his rifle, but the angle was all wrong. A tranquilizer could miss, or worse, hit Kumba. There was no clean shot. Kumba let out a groan, a deep, guttural sound that carried both rage and desperation. His massive hands clawed at the serpent's scales, managing to push them back just slightly before Naga recoiled and wrapped tighter. The gorilla's movement slowed, his strength beginning to fade. Elijah's pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped forward, then stopped again. His mind raced. If he fired now, he might save Kumba, or he might get both of them killed. If he did nothing, the outcome was certain. Kumba would die, and with him, the balance of the forest would shift in ways no one could predict. He lowered the rifle. No, he said to himself. I can't just watch. He dropped the gun quietly and unhooked a flare from his belt. One chance. He ignited it and flung it just beyond the serpent's head. The red light blazed to life, hissing in the grass. Naga flinched, releasing just enough pressure for Kumba to shift. Kumba's eyes flicked to Elijah. Recognition, a flash of something between them passed again, just as it had years ago. Elijah shouted, waving his arms, "Come on, you monster, over here." The snake turned. Its body uncoiled slightly, confused by the sudden light and noise. Kumba roared, using the moment to drive his knuckles into the serpent's head with a furious blow. Naga recoiled, snapping its jaws in pain and rage. Elijah took aim again. This time, he had the angle. He fired. The dart struck the serpent's upper body. Not enough to knock it out instantly, but enough to slow it. Naga hissed violently, thrashing in confusion. Its movements grew sluggish. Kumba stumbled away, panting, his fur streaked with blood, his shoulders heaving. Elijah rushed forward and fired the second dart into the serpent's lower back. Naga let out a final screeching hiss before collapsing in the grass. Coiled like a dying storm, the clearing fell silent, save for the ragged breath of Kumba. Elijah approached cautiously. The giant gorilla stood tall again, though swaying slightly, his body battered but unbroken. He looked down at the motionless serpent, then back at the man who had dared to help. They stared at one another, two guardians of the wild from different worlds. "I didn't come here to fight your battles," Elijah said quietly, "but I guess the forest chose otherwise." Kumba gave a single grunt, almost like a nod, then turned away and limped back into the trees, his broad back vanishing into the green. Elijah stood in the clearing a while longer, heart still racing, rifle lowered. He had faced predators before, but this had been something else entirely. Something ancient, something sacred, and he had chosen to act. That choice had saved the Guardian, and perhaps, in some small way, the soul of the forest itself. Elijah didn't hesitate. The moment he saw Kumba falter again under Naga's tightening coils, he dropped his rifle and lunged forward, grabbing a fallen branch from the forest floor. It was thick and half-broken, but heavy enough, with a shout that cut through the chaos like a war cry. He raised the makeshift weapon above his head and charged toward the serpent. "Hey, over here!" he roared, slamming the branch against Naga's thick body with all his strength. The sound echoed, a sharp, cracking thud. Naga hissed and whipped its massive head around, its attention yanked from Kumba to this new threat. Elijah struck again, raining down blows, each one fueled by desperation. The serpent reacted with terrifying speed. In a blur of muscle and scales, it lashed out, its tail sweeping Elijah off his feet and sending him sprawling into the grass. Pain shot through Elijah's ribs as he hit the ground hard. He coughed, air knocked from his lungs, but forced himself to scramble backward, just in time to avoid Naga's next strike. The serpent's mouth opened wide, jaws lined with backward curved fangs, and lunged. Elijah rolled, feeling the wind of its attack whistle past his face. He reached for the branch again, swung it wildly, catching Naga just beneath the eye. The snake reared up with a screeching hiss, furious now, and turned its full attention on him. Its body began to coil once more, this time around the man who dared interfere. Vines snapped, trees shivered as the great serpent surged forward. Elijah tried to move, but the tail wrapped around his ankle, dragging him back. The air filled with a dry, crackling sound, leaves torn from branches, grass crushed under the serpent's weight. He kicked, clawed, striking with the branch again as the tail looped around his legs. Then, suddenly, a new sound split through the frenzy. A guttural roar. Kumba, the silverback, had risen, blood still dripping from his wounds, eyes blazing with fury. He bared his teeth and charged at the serpent with primal force. Naga twisted its head too late. Kumba grabbed the snake just behind the jaw, teeth sinking deep into the muscular flesh of its neck. The serpent's body convulsed, its coils loosening just enough for Elijah to crawl free. The pain of Kumba's bite sent Naga thrashing wildly, slamming into trees, dislodging branches and sending birds screaming into the sky. Kumba held on, refusing to let go. The serpent's head jerked violently, but the gorilla clamped his jaws tighter, blood spilling down his chin. Elijah, now free, dragged himself behind a tree for cover. Gasping, he watched as the two creatures collided again in a whirlwind of scale and muscle. It was no longer a fight of predator and prey. It was survival. Pure and raw, the forest trembled around them. Kumba roared and beat his fists against Naga's thick body. The serpent retaliated, coiling again, this time looping around Kumba's arm and midsection. Both creatures grunted and hissed, straining to outlast the other. Trees cracked as the battle tore through the clearing. Elijah could only watch, stunned, as two titans fought beneath the canopy, their bodies smeared with blood and dirt. Then Kumba stumbled. His left leg gave out from under him, torn muscle, perhaps, or a rib broken by the constriction. Naga seized the moment, tightening its coils again, drawing the gorilla close to its jaws. No, Elijah rasped, staggering to his feet. He looked around desperately. His tranquilizer rifle lay yards away, out of reach, but he spotted something else, his emergency flare gun, clipped to his belt. With shaking hands, Elijah pulled it free, took aim, and fired. The flare screamed through the air, a streak of red light and smoke. It struck the forest floor just inches from the serpent's head and exploded in a shower of fire and sound. Naga reared up, momentarily blinded, confused. Kumba broke free with a powerful shove, lifting a broken tree limb and smashing it against the serpent's head. The blow connected with a sickening crunch. Naga reeled, its massive body spasming as its strength began to falter. But it wasn't over. The three of them, man, gorilla, and serpent, were now wounded, exhausted, and desperate. Blood soaked the earth beneath them. Naga slithered weakly toward the underbrush, body convulsing, eyes flickering with fading fire. Kumba collapsed to one knee, panting, watching to ensure the serpent didn't rise again. Elijah stood in the wreckage of the clearing, barely breathing. Everything was still. The battle had ended, but the cost was visible in every broken tree, every drop of blood. Kumba struggled to his feet and turned to Elijah once more. Their eyes met. This time, there were no words, no roars, just silence, mutual acknowledgement. They had both fought to protect the forest, and nearly died for it. Elijah gave a weak nod, his vision swimming. Kumba responded with a faint grunt before disappearing into the trees once more, leaving behind only footprints and the fading sound of his breath. Elijah fell to his knees and looked at the sky above. Sunlight broke through the canopy once more, illuminating the devastation below. The forest had survived, but only just, and so had he. The battle was over. The serpent's long, battered body lay still in the undergrowth, its scales dulled by dirt and blood. Smoke from the spent flare drifted upward in wisps, mixing with the scent of sweat, earth, and raw life. The clearing was quiet now, save for the slow, ragged breathing of the two survivors. Elijah Mwangi lay flat on the grass, his body aching from bruises and the force of impact. Every breath he took burned in his chest. But he didn't move, not yet. Beside him, not more than 10 feet away, lay Kumba, the great silverback gorilla. He, too, was still. His massive shoulders rose and fell slowly. His chest heaved with exhaustion. And his fur was streaked with blood, not all of it his own. For long moments, neither moved. There were no more roars, no more charges, no more cries of battle, only the strange stillness that followed the storm. The forest, too, seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the cost of what had just taken place. Elijah turned his head slightly, wincing at the pain in his ribs. Kumba remained where he was. But the gorilla's deep brown eyes met his. They stayed locked in that gaze, man and beast. Warrior and guardian, not as enemies. Not even as strangers, but as something else. Elijah could see it clearly now. The fire of fear had left Kumba's eyes. There was no challenge, no warning, just understanding, gratitude, and, perhaps, trust. Kumba grunted softly and shifted, rolling onto his side to better face the ranger. His movements were slow, deliberate, no longer aggressive. Elijah sat up carefully, wincing again as pain rippled through his shoulder. He glanced down at his hands, still shaking from the adrenaline. He reached into his pack and retrieved a small first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it was something. Kumba watched him closely, muscles tensed out of instinct. Elijah held up both hands to show he meant no harm, then gently approached, inch by inch. Kumba didn't move. "I know you don't need help," Elijah murmured, his voice low and even. "But I'm going to do it anyway." Kneeling beside the silverback, Elijah reached out and gently touched the gorilla's arm. Kumba flinched, but didn't pull away. With careful hands, Elijah wiped away some of the blood and cleaned a deep gash along the forearm. He applied antiseptic and wrapped the wound with a strip of clean cloth. The gorilla grunted, not in protest, but with the discomfort of being treated. Still, he remained still. Elijah moved to another wound on Kumba's flank, repeating the process. His hands worked with the steadiness of years spent healing wounded animals, though never one quite like this. Never one who looked at him not with suspicion, but with something deeper, something almost human. "I never thought I'd be doing this," Elijah said with a small, breathless laugh. "Helping you, like this, face to face." Kumba tilted his head slightly, as if studying Elijah. Then, slowly, the silverback lowered his great head and exhaled, a long, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of the fight and the years of solitude that came before it. When Elijah finished, he leaned back and rested on his heels. His own body throbbed with bruises and fatigue. He knew he couldn't stay long. Kumba was a wild animal, after all, as much as their bond had been forged in the fire of conflict. Elijah also knew the line between man and beast must be respected. He stood slowly, wincing at the tightness in his side, and stepped away. Kumba remained seated, watching him with calm eyes. He made no move to follow. No sign of hostility or warning. Just a quiet presence, unmoving, as if understanding Elijah's retreat was not abandonment, but respect. "You'll be all right," Elijah said quietly. "You've always known how to survive." He gave the gorilla one last nod, a gesture of respect and farewell, then turned back toward the forest path from which he'd come. Behind him, the jungle slowly returned to life, birds beginning to sing again. The rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. The ancient rhythm of the wild settling once more into balance. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew Kumba was watching. And he knew the bond they had forged, however brief, however wordless, was real. Something had shifted in that clearing. Elijah was no longer just an outsider, no longer a distant protector behind fences and scopes. He had stepped into the wild, into the conflict, and earned his place in it. By the time he reached the edge of Sector 9, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, painting the canopy in amber and shadow. His clothes were torn, his body ached, but his heart was steady. He radioed in his report with few words. There was too much to explain, too much that couldn't be put into language. That night, back at the outpost, Elijah stood beneath the stars, staring out into the forest beyond. Kumba was still out there, stronger than ever, and somewhere deep inside him, Elijah knew, if ever the forest called again, he would answer, not as a ranger, but as a guardian. The days that followed passed slowly, but the whispers moved quickly. News of the battle spread across Greenvale Wildlife Reserve, not from official reports, but from murmurs exchanged among rangers, researchers, and local guides. There were no photographs, no videos, only stories told in quiet tones around campfires and outposts. A ranger had stood beside the legendary Kumba. A serpent long believed to be myth had risen, and been defeated. The forest had shaken, and then it had settled. It didn't take long for the tale to grow beyond the facts. Some said Elijah Mwangi had tamed the gorilla. Others claimed the serpent had come from beneath the earth itself, driven out by ancient forces. In every version, one truth remained constant: the story of man and beast standing side by side against death. Elijah said nothing to confirm or deny any of it. He returned to his work, walking the trails as he always had, checking boundary markers, observing herds, and noting migrations. But those who worked beside him began to notice something different. There was a quietness to him now, not of weariness, but of reverence. He spoke more softly, he walked more lightly, when he paused beneath the trees. He seemed to be listening not for danger, but for the voice of the forest itself. He no longer carried his rifle slung across his back on every patrol. He still brought it. Of course, some precautions could never be abandoned, but now it stayed in his pack more often than not. Instead, Elijah relied more on his senses, on instinct, and on the quiet understanding that the wild would speak, if he was patient enough to listen. He would sometimes stand at the edge of Sector 9 and look into the trees. He never entered without purpose. He knew Kumba was still there, deep in the heart of the forest. Though he never saw him again. Not clearly. There were signs, fresh tracks along the riverbed, distant calls echoing through the canopy, the occasional rustle of something massive moving through the brush just out of sight. Once, on an early morning patrol, Elijah came across a patch of disturbed earth where grass had been trampled in a wide circle. In the center, a single strand of thick black fur. He crouched and picked it up gently, recognizing it at once. He didn't speak, he didn't call out, he simply looked up at the trees and smiled. Back at the main outpost, the story continued to grow. The young rangers asked Elijah about it often, especially the ones new to Green Vale. He always answered the same way, with a small shrug and a quiet, "It was the forest's doing, not mine." But his eyes told a deeper story. One evening, Lindaway approached him with a notebook in hand. "You should write it down," she said. "What happened in Sector 9? Before people twist it too far." Elijah thought for a moment and then shook his head. "Let them tell it the way they want. Stories like this, they belong to the wild, not to the page." And so, the story became legend, far away from the radio towers and patrol trails. Deep within the untouched parts of Green Vale, Kumba moved once more through his domain. The serpent was gone, no trace left but broken trees and a scar etched along the land, but the memory remained. And so did the scar on Kumba's side. It was a long mark, crossing his thick fur diagonally across his ribcage. The younger members of the troop would glance at it with a mix of awe and curiosity. To them, it was a symbol of strength, of endurance, and of something they couldn't fully understand. Kumba bore it with quiet dignity. He led his troop through the forest with the same confidence he always had. But now there was something new in his gaze. When he sat at the edge of a clearing and looked out across the trees, his eyes seemed to look further, and on rare occasions, when a distant sound stirred the underbrush and the birds took silent flight, he would pause, turn his head ever so slightly, and listen, not for threat, but for something else, for memory, for the echo of a moment when he had not stood alone. Once, as the sun rose over a mist-covered valley, a young gorilla reached out to touch Kumba's scar. The silverback turned, stared at the youth for a long moment, then gently placed a massive hand on the youngster's shoulder. There was no anger, no warning, only a look of calm. A lesson passed wordlessly from one generation to the next. Back in the outpost, Elijah watched the sunrise through a pair of binoculars, sipping from an old metal cup. His journal lay open on the table beside him, but the page remained blank. Some stories, he had decided, didn't need to be written to be remembered. He breathed deeply and looked toward the horizon. The wild was still wild. And though it never truly belonged to anyone, he had walked its edge, shared in its fury, and earned its respect. Not many could say that. Not many would ever understand what it meant. But Elijah knew, and so did Kumba, and somewhere between the rustling leaves, the deep calls of distant beasts, and the wind that whistled through the trees, the legacy of that moment lived on, not just as a tale, but as truth.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.